I've always been the adventurous type, and hiking in the mountains is my jam. The thrill of exploring new places gets my heart racing. So when my friends and I decided to hike in the mountains, I was pumped. I had heard some creepy stories about these mountains, but I didn't think much of them. I just wanted to have fun and enjoy the outdoors. The mountains were wild and rugged, with steep cliffs and deep canyons. The sun was blazing, and it felt great to be outside. But there was something about the place that felt a little off. The shadows seemed longer, and the air felt heavy, like something was lurking just out of sight. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the hike. There were 4 of us: me, Emily, Julian, and Claire. I was the adventurous one, always looking for the next thrill. Emily was really into nature, always stopping to admire the flowers or listen to the birds. She had this way of connecting with the land that made her seem almost magical. Julian was the skeptic, always rolling his eyes at the spooky stories we heard. He liked to poke fun at the legends, but I could tell he was a little uneasy too. Claire loved anything supernatural. She was fascinated by ghost stories and legends, and her excitement often made the rest of us feel a little more daring. As we hiked deeper into the mountains, the trees grew thicker, and the path became rockier. We were having a blast, laughing and joking, but I could feel a strange tension in the air. It was like the mountains were watching us. After a couple of hours, we stumbled upon a hidden canyon. It was beautiful, with high walls and a narrow floor. I felt like we had discovered a secret place. The sunlight filtered through the trees, creating a magical glow, but there was something about the silence that felt unsettling. While exploring, I spotted a small opening in the rocks. It looked like a cave, and I felt a rush of excitement. I led the group inside, shining my flashlight around. The walls were covered in strange symbols that looked ancient. I had never seen anything like it. It felt like we had stepped into a different world. Emily was drawn to the symbols, running her fingers over them, while Julian stood back, looking skeptical as usual. As we ventured further into the cave, the air grew cooler and more damp. I could hear the sound of dripping water echoing in the distance. The shadows seemed to move with us, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The atmosphere shifted, and I could sense that we were not alone. I glanced at my friends. Emily looked fascinated, her eyes wide with wonder. Julian was frowning, crossing his arms as if to shield himself from whatever was lurking in the dark. Claire was practically bouncing on her feet, her curiosity getting the better of her. Then, I found a small totem lying on the ground. It was made of stone, and it felt warm in my hand, almost like it was pulsing with energy. I could feel something deep inside me, a mix of excitement and fear. I showed it to my friends, and they gathered around, their eyes wide with curiosity. Emily seemed to connect with it right away, saying it felt powerful. Julian, however, scoffed and said it was just a rock. Claire was fascinated, her eyes sparkling with intrigue. I felt a rush of adrenaline. This was what I lived for, discovering the unknown. But as we stood there, admiring the totem, the atmosphere in the cave began to change. The air grew thick and heavy, and I could hear faint whispers echoing off the walls. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off as my imagination. We were in a cave, after all. It was bound to be creepy. As we continued to explore, the whispers grew louder, and shadows began to dance on the walls. I could see my friends becoming uneasy. Emily looked worried, and Julian's skepticism was fading. Claire seemed entranced, but even she was starting to feel the weight of the cave's energy. The excitement that had filled the air was slowly being replaced by a sense of dread. Tensions began to rise among us. Julian argued that we should leave, while Emily insisted we stay and figure out what the symbols meant. I felt torn. My adventurous spirit wanted to dig deeper, but I could sense that something was off. Claire was caught in the middle, trying to keep the peace. I could see her glancing nervously at the shadows, her earlier enthusiasm fading. Then, without warning, a loud rumble echoed through the cave. The ground shook beneath us. Panic set in as we realized a rock slide had started. The entrance was blocked, and we were trapped inside. My heart raced as I looked at my friends, fear etched on their faces. Emily was shaking, and Julian's bravado had vanished. Claire's eyes were wide with terror. The cave began to feel like a living thing, closing in around us. Shadows twisted and turned, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of voices. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. We were not alone in here. Something was watching us. We scrambled to find another way out, but the cave seemed to shift and change. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I could hear my friends breathing heavily, their panic growing. Emily was crying, and Julian was shouting for us to stay calm, but it was hard to keep my cool. Finally, we reached a small opening that looked like it might lead outside. We squeezed through, but as we did, I heard a loud crash behind us. The cave was collapsing. We scrambled to get out, and I could feel the ground shaking beneath us. Just as we made it through the opening, I turned to see the cave behind us crumble. Rocks fell, blocking the way we had come. We were free, but the relief was short-lived. We were now in a dark, narrow passage that felt like it went on forever. The whispers had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. We moved cautiously, unsure of what was ahead. I could feel the weight of the totem in my pocket, and it felt like it was burning a hole through my jeans. I had to get rid of it. It felt wrong, like it was connected to the darkness around us. As we continued through the passage, I could see light ahead. We hurried towards it, desperate to escape the cave. When we finally emerged, we found ourselves on the edge of a cliff overlooking a deep canyon. The view was breathtaking, but the sense of danger lingered. We were safe, but we were not the same. Some of us were shaken, while others were in shock. I could see the fear in Emily's eyes, and Julian was pale, as if he had seen a ghost. Claire was silent, her fascination with the supernatural now replaced by a deep sense of dread. We sat at the edge of the cliff, trying to catch our breath. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. I felt a mix of guilt and fear. I had led us into that cave, and now we were forever changed. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon, I realized that we had disturbed something ancient and powerful. The totem pulsed in my pocket, and I knew I had to get rid of it. It didn't belong to me, and it felt like it was calling out for something dark. With a deep breath, I took the totem and walked to the edge of the cliff. I held it in my hands, feeling its warmth. It pulsed like a heartbeat, and I could almost hear it calling to me. But I couldn't keep it. I had to let it go. With all my strength, I threw the totem into the canyon. I watched as it disappeared into the darkness below, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. I hoped that by letting it go, I could also release the darkness that had followed us. We packed up our gear and left the mountains behind. I could still feel the echoes of the cave in my mind, but I hoped that by facing my fears, I could find some peace. The mountains had taught me a valuable lesson about respect for nature and the unknown. As we drove away, I glanced back at the towering cliffs. They stood silent and imposing, holding their secrets close. I knew I would never forget this trip. It had changed me, and I hoped that I could carry the lessons learned into my future adventures. Some places are better left unexplored, and some secrets are meant to stay buried. My name is Sophie, and I am a mom who loves adventure. Last summer, my husband David and I decided to take our son Timmy camping for the weekend. We thought it would be a great way to get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life and spend some quality time together as a family. Timmy was beyond excited, bouncing in his seat as we drove to the campsite. I could see the anticipation in his eyes, and it made me smile. As we got closer, the trees grew taller and thicker, forming a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. The forest felt alive, stretching endlessly into the horizon. I felt a mix of excitement and unease as we pulled into the campsite. It was secluded, surrounded by towering trees and thick underbrush. The air was still, and an eerie silence settled over the place as dusk began to fall. Setting up the tent was a challenge. David and I fumbled with poles and fabric while Timmy explored the area, darting between trees and pretending he was a brave explorer. I watched him with a mix of pride and anxiety. He was so small, and the woods felt so big. I called out to him to stay close, but my words seemed to drift away into the stillness of the forest. Once the tent was up, we settled around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced across the trees. Timmy's laughter filled the air, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest transformed. The shadows deepened, and the woods grew more intimidating. It felt like the trees were closing in on us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After a while, we decided to call it a night. David tucked Timmy into his sleeping bag, and I lay down beside him, feeling the warmth of his small body next to mine. I drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't long before I was jolted awake by a rustling sound outside the tent. My heart raced as I listened intently, but the noise faded away. I told myself it was just the wind, but a nagging feeling of unease settled in my stomach. The next morning, I woke up to the sun streaming through the tent. Timmy was already up, his sleeping bag crumpled beside him. I called out for him, expecting him to come running in with a big smile, but there was no answer. I sat up, feeling a twinge of panic. David was still asleep, so I crawled out of the tent, scanning the campsite for any sign of my son. "Timmy!" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. I walked around the campsite, looking behind trees and underbrush, but there was no sign of him. My heart began to race as I turned back to the tent. David was awake now, rubbing his eyes and looking confused. "Where's Timmy?" I asked, my voice trembling. He sat up quickly, the sleep fading from his face. We both jumped to our feet, calling his name, searching every inch of the campsite. The panic set in as the minutes turned into what felt like hours. We checked the nearby trails, calling out for him, but the only response was the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. As the sun climbed higher, the fear in my chest grew heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. David tried to remain calm, organizing a search party of sorts. He suggested we split up and cover more ground. I wanted to scream that we shouldn't leave each other, but I knew we had to find Timmy. I wandered deeper into the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting and turning like skeletal fingers. I called out for Timmy, my voice cracking with fear. The forest felt alive, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. I stumbled over roots and tripped on rocks, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. After what felt like an eternity, I finally heard something. It was a faint sound, like a child's giggle. I rushed towards it, hope igniting in my chest. But as I got closer, the laughter faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I was completely alone. I turned back, retracing my steps, calling out for Timmy again. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer and darker. I could feel the weight of the trees pressing down, as if they were hiding something from me. I stumbled back to where David was searching, my heart racing with dread. When I found him, he was pale and frantic, his eyes wide with fear. We continued our search, but the hours dragged on, and the sun began to dip low in the sky. Just as despair started to settle in, we heard a rustling in the bushes. My heart leaped as I turned, praying it was Timmy. And then, there he was, standing just a few feet away. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly overshadowed by confusion. He looked unbothered, almost as if he had just been playing a game. I rushed to him, scooping him up in my arms, holding him tightly as tears streamed down my face. I could feel David's arms wrap around us, and for a moment, everything felt right again. But then I noticed something strange. Timmy was staring off into the woods, his eyes wide and unfocused. I gently pulled him back, asking him where he had been. He told us he had a new friend in the woods who had told him to stay put. My heart sank as I listened to him. Who was this friend? Why hadn't he come back with Timmy? David and I exchanged worried glances, the unease creeping back in. Timmy seemed so innocent, so unaware of the danger. I could feel the weight of fear pressing down on me again, and I struggled to keep my composure as I led him back to the campsite. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt different now, more menacing. The shadows seemed to stretch further, and the silence was deafening. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone lurking behind the trees. Once we reached the campsite, I sat Timmy down and hugged him tightly, not wanting to let go. David tried to calm me down, but I could see the worry etched on his face too. We decided to pack up and leave as soon as possible. The sun was setting, and the woods were becoming increasingly dark and foreboding. While we packed, I kept glancing at Timmy, who was playing with a stick, seemingly unfazed by the events of the day. I wanted to ask him more about his friend, but the words wouldn't come. I was too scared of what he might say. As we drove away from the campsite, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but it was mixed with an unsettling feeling that wouldn't go away. Timmy was safe, but the experience had shaken me to my core. I kept replaying the day in my mind, the fear, the panic, and the eerie silence of the forest. When we got home, everything felt different. The familiar surroundings that once brought me comfort now felt like a false sense of security. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to pounce. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal, but the memory of that weekend haunted me. I found myself watching Timmy closely, my protective instincts heightened. I wanted to shield him from the world, from the unknown dangers that lurked in the shadows. David and I talked about the trip often, trying to make sense of what had happened. We both felt the weight of guilt, wondering if we could have done something differently. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had failed Timmy somehow, that we had let him wander too far into the unknown. The forest remained a dark, looming presence in my mind. I couldn't help but think about Timmy's friend, the mysterious figure he spoke of. Who were they? What did they want? The questions lingered, unanswered and unsettling. As time went on, I became more cautious, more protective. I found myself avoiding wooded areas, steering clear of anything that reminded me of that weekend. I wanted to keep Timmy safe, to shield him from the dangers that seemed to lurk just beyond our doorstep. In the end, that camping trip changed us. It left us with a sense of unease that we couldn't shake. The innocence of that weekend was replaced by a lingering fear of the unknown. I knew that I would never look at the forest the same way again, and the shadows that danced among the trees would forever haunt my thoughts. My name is Luthra, and I'm just a regular city girl who got tired of the noise and craziness of urban life. I needed a break, something to help me clear my head. That's when I heard about this place called La Forêt de Murmures, or the Whispering Forest. It sounded like the perfect escape, so I packed my bags and hit the road. Driving into the forest was like entering a different world. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The sky was overcast, casting a gloomy shadow over everything. It felt heavy, almost like the air was thick with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I was nervous but also excited. Nature had always been a place where I felt a little more at peace, away from the chaos of the city. I found a trailhead and decided to go for a hike. As I walked, the sounds of the city faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It was nice at first, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more I felt like I was being watched. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After a while, I came across an old man sitting on a log. He looked like he belonged to the forest, with a long beard and clothes that seemed to blend in with the trees. He stared into the distance, and for a moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. He turned to me and warned me about the forest, saying something about a watcher. I didn't really pay much attention. I was too eager to explore. As I continued down the trail, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. The trees were so close together, and the shadows were getting longer. I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. I just wanted to enjoy my hike and forget about everything else. Then, out of nowhere, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was hidden away, almost like it was waiting for someone to find it. The cabin looked like it had been there for ages, with vines crawling up the sides and the roof sagging under the weight of time. Something about it drew me in, and I felt a strange pull to explore. I pushed the creaky door open and stepped inside. The air was musty, filled with the smell of decay. Broken furniture was scattered everywhere, and dust covered every surface. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I was too curious to turn back. I started to look around, hoping to find something interesting. That's when I found an old journal tucked away under some debris. I pulled it out and brushed off the dust. The pages were yellowed and frayed, but the writing was still legible. It belonged to a family that had lived in the cabin years ago. As I read through the entries, my heart sank. They wrote about strange things happening in the cabin, whispers in the walls, shadows moving when no one was there, and a feeling of being watched. The more I read, the more disturbed I became. The family's sanity seemed to unravel as they wrote about their fears and the entity they called the Watcher. They believed it was a guardian of the forest, but it sounded more like a malevolent force. The final entries were frantic, filled with panic and despair. They mentioned that they could feel it feeding off their fear, and then, just like that, the entries stopped. They vanished without a trace. I sat there, clutching the journal, feeling a knot in my stomach. The cabin felt alive, as if it was breathing around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided it was time to leave. As I turned to go, I noticed a strange symbol carved into the wall. It looked like some kind of occult symbol, and it sent chills down my spine. I felt like I was stepping into something that was way over my head. When I finally made it back to my car, I sat there for a while, trying to process everything I had just read. The old man's warning echoed in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder if he knew more than he let on. I should have just driven away and forgotten about the cabin, but something kept pulling me back. I had to know more. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin and the family's journal. I spent hours online, searching for information about the forest and the cabin. I found a few articles about the family, but they were mostly just missing persons reports. No one seemed to know what had happened to them, and that only made me more curious. I came across some legends about the Watcher. According to the stories, it was a malevolent spirit that guarded the forest, feeding off the fears of those who entered. The more I read, the more I felt like I had to go back to the cabin. I knew it was risky, but I felt like I was meant to confront whatever was there. So, I packed my bag again and headed back to the forest. The drive felt different this time. The trees seemed darker, and the air was heavier. When I arrived at the trailhead, the old man was there again. He looked at me with a mix of concern and pity, but I brushed him off and continued on my way. As I approached the cabin, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The air crackled with tension, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. I pushed open the door, and the musty smell hit me like a wall. I stepped inside, and that's when I noticed something was different. The atmosphere felt thicker, almost suffocating. I made my way back to the hidden room I had found before. I felt like I was being drawn to it, like it was calling my name. When I opened the door, I was hit with a wave of darkness. The room was filled with disturbing artifacts and symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I felt a rush of panic as I realized these symbols were connected to my own fears and anxieties. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, soft and eerie, echoing in the room. It felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my heart racing. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, and I felt an overwhelming presence closing in around me. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, breathing and watching me. Then, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It was dark and indistinct, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, threatening to drown me. The voice whispered again, welcoming me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I realized then that this was the Watcher. I tried to back away, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The shadows seemed to wrap around me, pulling me closer to the figure. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew I had to escape. But the fear was paralyzing. The figure began to take shape, and I could see it was a manifestation of my own guilt and trauma. It was feeding off my fear, forcing me to relive my darkest memories. In that moment, I understood what I had to do. I had to confront my fears head-on. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to summon every ounce of courage I had. I thought about everything I had been through, all the pain and guilt that had haunted me for so long. I realized that I couldn't let this entity control me any longer. With that thought, I opened my eyes and faced the figure. I refused to let it take hold of me. I stood my ground, reminding myself that I was stronger than my fears. The shadows began to recede, and the figure started to fade. I felt a surge of power within me, and I knew I could break free. I turned and ran out of the cabin, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I sat there, shaking and gasping for breath, but I felt different. I had faced my fears and come out the other side. I knew I still had a long way to go, but I felt a sense of relief wash over me. In the weeks that followed, I sought help and began to work through my trauma. It wasn't easy, but I was determined to confront my past and heal. I learned that the cabin and the entity were manifestations of my own struggles. They had been feeding on my fear, but now I was taking back my power. I never went back to the cabin or the forest. I knew the entity was still there, waiting for its next victim, but I also knew that I had the strength to resist it. I had faced my fears and come out stronger, and that knowledge gave me a sense of peace. As I continued my journey of healing, I realized that I was not alone. I had the support of friends and professionals who understood what I was going through. I learned to embrace my vulnerabilities and use them as stepping stones toward personal growth. Looking back, I realized that the experience in the cabin was a turning point in my life. It pushed me to confront my fears and take control of my own narrative. I had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. It was supposed to be a fun summer camping trip with friends. Just a chance to get away from the city noise and enjoy some time in nature. I was excited, even though I had a few butterflies in my stomach about spending the night in the woods. But I figured I'd be fine with my friends around. We drove out to this remote campsite, surrounded by thick trees and a whole lot of nothing. The sun was shining when we got there, and everything felt warm and inviting. Jake, our unofficial leader, was in a great mood, cracking jokes and setting up the tent like he was a pro. Emily, on the other hand, looked a bit nervous. She kept glancing around, like she sensed something off. I tried to brush it off and told myself everything would be okay. As the sun dipped down, we gathered around the campfire. The flames flickered, and we roasted marshmallows, laughing and sharing stories. The forest was super quiet, almost too quiet. The trees were so thick that it felt like they were swallowing up all the sounds. I could hear the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves, but that was about it. It was peaceful, but after a while, the silence started to feel a little eerie. Then we heard it. A laughter echoed through the trees, a high-pitched giggle that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. It sent chills down my spine. I looked at Jake, who was trying to stay cool, but I could see the tension in his face. Emily's eyes went wide, and I could tell she was starting to freak out. The laughter kept going, getting louder and closer, like it was circling us. I felt a knot in my stomach. It didn't sound like it belonged in the peaceful woods. It felt wrong. Jake tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just some kids messing around, but deep down, I knew it was something more. As the night went on, the laughter became more frequent, echoing through the trees like a creepy song. It felt like it was playing with us, drawing us in. I could see Emily's fear growing, and I started to feel it too. The laughter was unsettling, and it didn't sound friendly at all. At one point, Jake suggested we check out where the laughter was coming from. I hesitated, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. But I didn't want to seem scared in front of my friends, so I went along with it. Emily looked like she was about to cry, but Jake was determined, so we all followed him deeper into the forest. As we walked, the laughter faded into an eerie silence. It was like the forest had swallowed the sound. The lack of noise was almost worse than the laughter. The trees loomed over us, and I felt like they were watching us. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something lurking behind the trunks. We walked for what felt like ages, the darkness closing in around us. Finally, we stumbled into a small clearing. The moonlight broke through the trees, lighting up the area. But instead of feeling relieved, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air felt heavy, and the silence was suffocating. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake looked around, trying to act brave, but I could see he was starting to doubt himself. Emily was practically shaking, and I felt a surge of panic. Just as we were about to turn back, the laughter erupted again. It was louder this time, more sinister, echoing through the clearing. It felt like it was coming from all directions, wrapping around us like a dark cloud. We turned and ran back the way we came, the laughter following us, taunting us. The trees seemed to close in, and I could feel the branches scratching at my arms as we pushed through the underbrush. I could hear Emily gasping behind me, and I felt a rush of adrenaline as we raced toward the campsite. When we finally burst out of the trees and back into the clearing where our tent was set up, we collapsed onto the ground, panting and shaking. The laughter had stopped, but the unsettling feeling lingered. The fire was still crackling, but it felt like a fragile barrier between us and whatever was out there in the darkness. We sat in silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging over us. Emily looked terrified, her eyes wide. Jake tried to reassure us, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. We were all on edge, and the laughter had left a mark on our minds. As the night dragged on, we huddled around the fire, trying to shake off the fear. But the silence of the forest felt oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The laughter had been playful and sinister, and I couldn't help but wonder what had caused it. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept imagining the laughter echoing through the trees. I could see Emily tossing and turning, her face pale and drawn. I felt a sense of dread settling in my stomach, and I knew we wouldn't be able to relax until morning. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing and more serene. But the memory of the laughter lingered in the back of my mind, a haunting reminder of the night before. We packed up our campsite, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken fear. I could see that none of us wanted to talk about what had happened, but it hung in the air like a thick fog. As we drove away from the forest, I glanced back at the trees, feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease. The laughter echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had encountered something beyond our understanding. It was a reminder that the woods held secrets, and not all of them were friendly. In the days that followed, I found it hard to shake off the experience. I kept replaying the events of that night in my head, trying to make sense of it all. The laughter, the eerie silence, and the feeling of being watched haunted me. I talked to Jake and Emily about it, but we all seemed to agree that it was better left unspoken. Eventually, we all went back to our normal lives, but the experience left a mark on us. I found myself avoiding the woods, feeling an irrational fear every time I passed by a forested area. I knew that the laughter was just a memory, but it felt like a warning, a reminder of the unknown. That summer night in the forest changed something in me. I learned that nature can be beautiful and terrifying all at once. The laughter that echoed through the trees would forever be etched in my mind, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lie beyond what we can see. And though I tried to forget, I knew that the forest would always hold its secrets, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers to wander into its depths. As time passed, I found myself reflecting more on that night. I began to wonder about the stories that the forest held, about the things that had happened long before we arrived. I realized that the laughter wasn't just a random sound. It felt like it had a purpose, like it was trying to tell us something. I started reading about the history of the area, looking for clues about the forest and its legends. I learned about old tales of spirits and creatures that roamed the woods. Some stories were about lost souls, while others warned of mischievous entities that played tricks on unsuspecting visitors. Each story added to the mystery, and I couldn't help but feel a strange connection to the forest. As the seasons changed and summer turned to fall, I found myself drawn back to the idea of camping again. I wanted to face my fear, to confront whatever it was that had haunted me that night. I talked to Jake and Emily about it, and they were hesitant but agreed to go back with me. We decided to return to the same campsite, hoping that maybe this time we could find some answers. When we arrived, the forest felt different. The leaves were changing colors, and the air was crisp and cool. It was beautiful, but I could still feel the weight of what had happened hanging over us. As we set up camp, I could see the tension in Emily's face. She looked nervous, and I couldn't blame her. I felt it too. That night, we gathered around the fire again, trying to shake off the fear. The laughter was still fresh in our minds, and we talked about what we might encounter. As darkness fell, the forest grew quiet, and I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting the laughter to echo through the night. As the hours passed, the silence became almost unbearable. I could see Emily fidgeting, and Jake was trying to keep the mood light, but I could tell he was on edge too. Just when I thought we might get through the night without incident, we heard it again. The laughter echoed through the trees, just like before. This time, it felt different. It was louder and more chaotic, like it was mocking us. I could see Emily's face pale as she gripped her arms tightly. Jake tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The laughter twisted through the trees, wrapping around us like a sinister blanket. In that moment, we knew we had to do something. We couldn't just sit there and let it consume us. We decided to follow the sound, hoping to find its source. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the laughter grew louder, filling the air with a sense of dread. We pushed through the underbrush, the branches scratching at our arms as we made our way into the darkness. The laughter seemed to lead us, pulling us closer to whatever was out there. I felt my heart racing, and I could see the fear in Jake and Emily's eyes. We were all terrified, but there was no turning back now. Finally, we reached a small clearing, and the laughter stopped abruptly. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the world. The sudden silence was deafening, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The air felt heavy, and I could sense that something was wrong. We stood there, frozen in place, trying to catch our breath. The trees loomed around us, their twisted branches creating a dark canopy overhead. I felt like we were being watched, and I could see Emily trembling beside me. Jake looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but I could tell he was just as scared as we were. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the shadows. It was tall and dark, blending into the forest like it was part of the trees. I felt my heart drop as the figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. The figure seemed to shift and change, almost like it was playing with our minds. I could hear whispers in the wind, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. It was like the laughter had transformed into something far more sinister. We were no longer just dealing with a sound. We were face to face with whatever had been haunting us. In that moment, I realized that we had stumbled into something we couldn't understand. The laughter had been a warning, a way for the forest to test us. And now, we were trapped in its grasp. We turned to run, but the figure was blocking our path. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as we stumbled backward, trying to find a way out. The laughter returned, echoing through the trees, and I felt like it was mocking us. It was a cruel reminder of our fear, and I knew we had to escape. We pushed through the underbrush, the branches tearing at our clothes as we ran. I could hear Emily crying behind me, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. We had to get back to the campsite. We had to make it out of the forest. Finally, we broke through the trees and back into the clearing where our tent was set up. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The laughter had stopped, but the weight of what we had just experienced lingered. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, too scared to sleep. The forest felt alive, and I could sense that it was watching us. I knew that we had encountered something beyond our understanding, something that would haunt us for a long time. As dawn broke, we packed up our campsite in silence, the experience hanging over us like a dark cloud. I glanced back at the forest one last time, feeling a mix of relief and dread. I knew that the laughter would forever echo in my mind, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lie beyond what we can see. We drove away from the campsite, the laughter still ringing in my ears. I realized that the forest held secrets we would never fully understand, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for the next unsuspecting campers to wander into its depths. The laughter would always be there, a haunting reminder of the unknown. Camping trips are supposed to be fun, right? A chance to escape the city and soak up some fresh air. That was the plan when I decided to join my friends for a weekend in the woods. I was looking forward to it, even though the weather forecast warned us about a storm. I thought, how bad could it be? A little rain and wind wouldn't ruin our adventure. I was so wrong. We drove out to this remote campsite surrounded by tall trees and a whole lot of quiet. The sun was shining when we got there, but I could already feel the wind picking up. Akira, the most adventurous guy in our group, was buzzing with excitement about the storm. He kept talking about how cool it would be to experience nature's power. May, on the other hand, looked nervous. She kept glancing at the sky, watching the clouds gather. I felt a little uneasy too, but I tried to shake it off. After we set up our tent, we gathered around the campfire, trying to stay warm as the temperature dropped. The wind howled through the trees, making them sway and creak. It felt like the forest was alive, and I couldn't help but feel a little anxious. The air was charged, and I could tell something was coming. As the sun dipped down, the storm hit us hard. The wind roared, and the rain came pouring down in sheets. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as the storm raged on. May was shivering beside me, her face pale with fear. I wanted to reassure her, but I was scared too. Then we heard it. A loud, eerie howl caught through the howling wind. It didn't sound like anything I had ever heard before. It was high-pitched and seemed to come from all directions. I froze, my heart racing. Akira looked confused, and May's eyes widened in fear. The howling continued, growing louder and more menacing. It felt like something was out there, watching us. The wind picked up even more, and the howling became part of it, twisting and distorting in a way that made my skin crawl. I could see May's fear escalating, while Akira seemed fascinated, almost thrilled. He wanted to go check it out, but I could feel the dread settling in my stomach. Despite our fears, we decided to investigate. Akira led the way, and I followed reluctantly, feeling like we were walking into a trap. The deeper we went into the forest, the louder the howling became. It was like it was beckoning us, daring us to come closer. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as we pushed through the trees. The wind howled around us, and the branches scratched at our arms. I wanted to turn back, but Akira kept moving forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. May was right beside me, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. The howling was relentless, echoing through the trees and drowning out everything else. Finally, we reached a small clearing. The moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the area. But instead of feeling relieved, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was heavy, and the silence that followed the howling was deafening. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, out of nowhere, the howling returned, but this time it was louder and more intense. It felt like it was all around us, swirling in the air. I wanted to run, to get away from that sound, but my feet felt glued to the spot. I could see Akira looking around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, but it was impossible to tell. Suddenly, a dark shape emerged from the shadows. It was tall and twisted, moving in a way that didn't seem natural. I felt my heart drop as the figure drew closer. The howling intensified, and I could feel the fear gripping my chest. It was like the figure was feeding off our terror, growing stronger with each passing moment. We turned and ran, the wind whipping at our backs. The howling followed us, echoing through the trees and making it impossible to escape. I could feel the branches scratching at my arms as we pushed through the underbrush, desperate to get back to the campsite. When we finally burst out of the trees and back into the clearing, we collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The howling had stopped, but the fear remained. We huddled together, shaking and trying to process what had just happened. The campfire flickered weakly, but it felt like a fragile barrier against whatever was lurking in the darkness. As the night dragged on, we sat around the fire, too shaken to sleep. The forest felt alive, and I could sense that it was watching us. I knew that we had encountered something beyond our understanding, something that would haunt us for a long time. Eventually, the storm began to subside, but the fear lingered. We spent the night wide awake, listening to the wind and jumping at every little noise. It felt like we were trapped in a nightmare, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The forest looked different in the light, less menacing and more serene. But the memory of the howling wind haunted me. I knew I would never look at the woods the same way again. We packed up our campsite in silence, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken fear. I glanced back at the trees, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. The howling wind had changed something in me. I realized that nature could be beautiful and terrifying all at once. As we drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was hiding something. The howling wind echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lay beyond what we could see. I knew I would never forget that night, and I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the forest held. In the days that followed, I found it hard to shake off the experience. I kept replaying the events of that night in my head, trying to make sense of it all. The howling wind, the dark figure, and the feeling of being watched haunted me. I talked to Akira and May about it, but we all seemed to agree that it was better left unspoken. Eventually, we returned to our normal lives, but the experience left a mark on us. I found myself jumping at every sudden noise, every unexpected gust of wind. I couldn't shake the memory of that dark figure, of the pure malice in its howl. I knew that I had to find a way to move on, to put the experience behind me. But it wasn't easy. As time passed, I found myself reflecting more on that night. I began to wonder about the stories that the forest held, about the things that had happened long before we arrived. I realized that the howling wind wasn't just a random sound. It felt like it had a purpose, like it was trying to tell us something. I started reading about the history of the area, looking for clues about the forest and its legends. I found old tales of spirits and creatures that roamed the woods. Some stories were about lost souls, while others warned of mischievous entities that played tricks on unsuspecting visitors. Each story added to the mystery, and I couldn't help but feel a strange connection to the forest. As the seasons changed and summer turned to fall, I found myself drawn back to the idea of camping again. I wanted to face my fear, to confront whatever it was that had haunted me that night. I talked to Akira and May about it, and they were hesitant but agreed to go back with me. We decided to return to the same campsite, hoping that maybe this time we could find some answers. When we arrived, the forest felt different. The leaves were changing colors, and the air was crisp and cool. It was beautiful, but I could still feel the weight of what had happened hanging over us. As we set up camp, I could see the tension in May's face. She looked nervous, and I couldn't blame her. I felt it too. That night, we gathered around the fire again, trying to shake off the fear. The howling was still fresh in our minds, and we talked about what we might encounter. As darkness fell, the forest grew quiet, and I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting the howling to echo through the night. As the hours passed, the silence became almost unbearable. I could see May fidgeting, and Akira was trying to keep the mood light, but I could tell he was on edge too. Just when I thought we might get through the night without incident, we heard it again. The howling echoed through the trees, just like before. This time, it felt different. It was louder and more chaotic, like it was mocking us. I could see May's face pale as she gripped her arms tightly. Akira tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The howling twisted through the trees, wrapping around us like a sinister blanket. In that moment, we knew we had to do something. We couldn't just sit there and let it consume us. We decided to follow the sound, hoping to find its source. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the howling grew louder, filling the air with a sense of dread. We pushed through the underbrush, the branches scratching at our clothes as we made our way into the darkness. The howling seemed to lead us, pulling us closer to whatever was out there. I felt my heart racing, and I could see the fear in Akira and May's eyes. We were all terrified, but there was no turning back now. Finally, we reached a small clearing, and the howling stopped abruptly. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the world. The sudden silence was deafening, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The trees loomed around us, their twisted branches creating a dark canopy overhead. I felt like we were being watched, and I could see May trembling beside me. Akira looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but I could tell he was just as scared as we were. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the shadows. It was tall and dark, blending into the forest like it was part of the trees. I felt my heart drop as the figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. The figure seemed to shift and change, almost like it was playing with our minds. I could hear whispers in the wind, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. It was like the howling had transformed into something far more sinister. We were no longer just dealing with a sound. We were face to face with whatever had been haunting us. In that moment, I realized that we had stumbled into something we couldn't understand. The howling had been a warning, a way for the forest to test us. And now, we were trapped in its grasp. We turned to run, but the figure was blocking our path. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as we stumbled backward, trying to find a way out. The howling returned, echoing through the trees, and I felt like it was mocking us. It was a cruel reminder of our fear, and I knew we had to escape. We pushed through the underbrush, the branches tearing at our clothes as we ran. I could hear May crying behind me, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. We had to get back to the campsite. We had to make it out of the forest. Finally, we broke through the trees and back into the clearing where our tent was set up. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The howling had stopped, but the weight of what we had just experienced lingered. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, too scared to sleep. The forest felt alive, and I could sense that it was watching us. I knew that we had encountered something beyond our understanding, something that would haunt us for a long time. As dawn broke, we packed up our campsite in silence, the experience hanging over us like a dark cloud. I glanced back at the forest one last time, feeling a mix of relief and dread. I knew that the howling would forever echo in my mind, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lie beyond what we can see. We drove away from the campsite, the howling still ringing in my ears. I realized that the forest held secrets we would never fully understand, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for the next unsuspecting campers to wander into its depths. The howling would always be there, a haunting reminder of the unknown. I'm all about adventure. Growing up, I was always the one dragging my friends into the great outdoors, hiking, camping, you name it. Nature's my thing. It's like hitting the pause button on the craziness of everyday life. But I've learned that while nature is awesome, it's also got its dangers. So, when my friends and I planned this camping trip for late fall, I was all in. We needed a break from our busy lives, and camping sounded like the perfect escape. Little did I know, this trip would end up being something I'd never forget. It wasn't just a camping trip, it turned into an experience I still shudder to think about. The weather was just right when we arrived. It was late fall, so the trees were flaunting their fall colors, vivid reds, oranges, and yellows. The air was crisp, almost icy, and the forest around us looked like it was straight out of a postcard. We found this clearing and set up our tents. The tall trees surrounding us seemed to whisper secrets with the breeze, making the whole place feel a bit eerie. Once we were all set, Mike, one of my friends who's always up for something wild, brought up this old story he'd heard. There was this abandoned cabin somewhere in the woods, and Mike thought it would be an adventure to check it out. He was practically buzzing with excitement. Now, I've got to admit, the idea of exploring a creepy, old cabin didn't exactly thrill me. I was pretty content with our cozy campsite, but Mike's enthusiasm was contagious. Plus, the others were on board, so I figured, why not? I didn't want to be the buzzkill. So, we grabbed our flashlights and decided to head out before it got dark. The path to the cabin was overgrown and narrow, with branches reaching out like they were trying to grab us. The forest was getting darker and denser, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was like something was lurking just out of sight. After what felt like forever, we finally stumbled upon the cabin. It was hidden behind a bunch of bushes, like nature was trying to swallow it up. The place looked ancient. Its wooden walls were rotting, and the windows were broken. It stood in stark contrast to the vibrant forest around it. I felt a shiver run down my spine as we approached. The door creaked open with a groan, and a musty smell hit us like a brick wall. Inside, the cabin was dark and dusty. The floorboards groaned under our weight, and the air felt thick with dust. My flashlight beam revealed cobwebs in every corner and old furniture covered in layers of grime. It was clear no one had been here in years. Mike was already poking around, checking out the old fireplace and running his hands over the walls. I followed him, trying to ignore the weird vibe I was getting. Laura, another friend, was hanging back by the door, looking uneasy. Seeing her worry made me feel a bit better, at least I wasn't the only one who was creeped out. As we moved deeper into the cabin, strange noises started happening. At first, it was just the wind whistling through the cracks. But then we began hearing soft thumps and rustling sounds coming from the shadows. I glanced over at Laura, and she looked more anxious by the second. She suggested we head back, but Mike wasn't having any of it. He was all about the adventure, insisting we stay and see what would happen. The others agreed with him, and I felt a pressure to go along with it. I didn't want to be the one who ruined the fun, so I kept my mouth shut. But inside, I was starting to regret this decision. As night fell, the cabin got even creepier. The temperature dropped, and shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the dim light of our flashlights. We tried to make the best of it, telling stories and laughing to keep the mood light. But I could feel the tension building. The strange noises kept up, and every little sound made my heart race. At one point, I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the old cabin and my friends, who were too busy with their own conversations to notice my discomfort. Laura's fear was really starting to show. She kept glancing at the windows, her eyes wide with worry. I could see she was torn between staying and leaving. I felt the same way, but Mike was insistent on staying. He kept saying it was all in our heads, and that we were just letting our imaginations run wild. Then, it happened. Out of nowhere, there was this loud crash. It echoed through the cabin and made us all jump. It sounded like something had fallen over in the back room. My heart was pounding as we exchanged nervous glances. Mike, being the brave one, headed toward the noise with his flashlight. I wanted to tell him to stop and get out of there, but I was too scared to speak. Mike pushed open the door to the back room and shone his flashlight inside. What he saw made him drop the flashlight. It shattered on the floor, sending eerie shadows dancing around the room. Mike stumbled backward, his face as pale as a ghost. I asked him what he'd seen, my voice trembling. Mike just shook his head, too shocked to speak. The rest of us crowded around, but he could only shake his head, his eyes wide with terror. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the room Mike had just checked out. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. In the dim light of the broken flashlight, I saw a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at me. I froze, my whole body going cold. The creature let out another deep, menacing growl. It was like nothing I had ever heard before. I don't know how I managed it, but I found the strength to turn and run. I could hear the others behind me, their footsteps pounding on the creaky floorboards as we all bolted for the door. We raced out of the cabin and didn't stop running until we reached the safety of our campsite. None of us slept that night. Every little noise made us jump. We packed up our stuff as soon as the sun came up and got the heck out of there. We didn't look back. To this day, I still don't know what that thing was in the cabin. And honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'm never going to explore an abandoned building in the middle of the woods again. Sometimes, it's better to leave things undiscovered. Some experiences are just too terrifying to be worth it. I love camping, but sometimes it can be a little creepy, you know? Like, when you're sitting around the campfire at night, and the shadows start playing tricks on your eyes. That's how I felt when my friends and I decided to go camping in the woods last summer. We were all excited to get away from the city and spend some time in nature, but little did we know what we were in for. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The woods around us were dark and thick, and the air had a chill to it. We quickly set up our tent and gathered some firewood, eager to get a fire going. Mark, one of the guys in our group, was in charge of the fire. He was always the outdoorsy type, so we figured he knew what he was doing. As the sun disappeared and darkness fell, we huddled around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The flickering flames cast long shadows that danced across the trees, and I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. There was something about the way the shadows moved that seemed almost alive. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on having fun with my friends. We laughed and joked, and for a while, it felt like we were the only people in the world. But then something strange started to happen with the fire. The flames began to flicker and dance in a way that didn't seem natural. They would suddenly grow larger and brighter, casting distorted shadows that made my skin crawl. Mark tried to adjust the fire, adding more wood and rearranging the logs, but it didn't seem to help. If anything, it made the fire behave even more erratically. I glanced around at my friends, wondering if they were seeing what I was seeing. Julia, a girl I had a crush on, looked uneasy. Her eyes were wide, and she kept glancing at the fire with a worried expression. I wanted to say something to her, to let her know that I was feeling the same way, but the words caught in my throat. The fire continued to behave strangely, the flames twisting and turning in ways that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The shadows they cast became more and more disturbing, taking on shapes that I couldn't quite make out. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that something was wrong, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. As the night wore on, the fire's behavior only got worse. It would suddenly flare up, the flames reaching for the sky, and then die down to barely glowing embers. The shadows it cast became more and more menacing, twisting and turning in ways that made me feel like I was being watched. I could see the fear in my friends' eyes as they huddled closer to the fire, seeking its warmth and comfort. But the fire itself seemed to be the source of our fear, as if it was feeding off our terror and growing stronger with each passing moment. Finally, as the fire reached its peak, something happened that made my blood run cold. The flames suddenly flared up, casting a bright light that illuminated the entire campsite. And in that moment, I saw something that I will never forget. The shadows that the fire cast were no longer just shapes on the ground. They had taken on a life of their own, twisting and turning in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics. And as I watched, horrified, I realized that they were forming images that were familiar to each of us. I saw my own face, twisted in terror, and the faces of my friends. I saw scenes from our past, moments that we had shared together, but they were distorted and twisted, as if seen through a funhouse mirror. And then, as the fire died down, I saw something else, something that made my heart skip a beat. It was a face that I had never seen before. It was pale and gaunt, with sunken eyes and a twisted smile. And as I watched, transfixed, the face seemed to move, as if it was alive. I blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the flickering shadows of the dying fire. I don't know how long we sat there, staring at the fire in silence. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. All I knew was that I was terrified, and I could see the same fear reflected in the faces of my friends. Finally, Mark spoke up, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here," he said, his eyes darting around the campsite. Now, we didn't need to be told twice. We quickly gathered our things and packed up the tent, our hands trembling as we worked. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting an eerie glow over the campsite. As we walked away, I couldn't help but glance back at the fire. It seemed to be watching us, as if it was alive. I shuddered, and quickened my pace, eager to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. We didn't stop walking until we reached our car, parked on the side of the road. We piled in, our hearts racing, and drove away from the campsite as fast as we could. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the sound of our breathing. I don't know how long we drove, but eventually we pulled over at a gas station. We all got out of the car, stretching our legs and trying to calm our nerves. Julia came over to me, her eyes red from crying. "What was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did we see?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. But whatever it wasn't natural. We talked for a while, trying to make sense of what had happened. But the more we talked, the more confused and scared we became. The images we had seen in the fire were burned into our minds, and we knew that we would never be able to forget them. As we drove home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. We had come to the woods to escape the chaos of the city, to find peace and solace in nature. But instead, we had encountered something that had shaken us to our core. The woods, once a place of beauty and wonder, now felt like a dark and dangerous place, full of secrets that we could never hope to understand. In the days that followed, I found myself unable to shake the memory of that night. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the image of the twisted face burned into my mind. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the memory of that campfire and the shadows it had cast. My friends were the same way. We would meet up, our eyes haunted, and talk about what had happened. But no matter how much we talked, we could never make sense of it. The campfire had been a source of light and warmth, but it had also been a gateway to something dark and terrifying, something that we could never have imagined. As time passed, the memory of that night began to fade, but the fear never went away. I found myself looking at the world differently, more cautious and more aware of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. The woods, once a place of adventure and exploration, now filled me with a sense of dread. I still go camping sometimes, but I always make sure to bring a flashlight. I can't bear the thought of sitting around a campfire, watching the shadows dance and twist. I know that if I did, I would see those images again, the twisted faces and the distorted scenes from my past. And so, I keep my distance from the woods, and from the campfires that burn within them. I know that there are some things that are better left unexplored, some mysteries that are better left unsolved. The campfire may have been the last one I ever built, but it is a memory that will haunt me for the rest of my life.